They came from all quarters, union, non-union, African American, Hispanic American, Asian American, Arab American, Muslim American. We had everybody, and it was beautiful. It was a historic realignment. Uniting citizens.
That's a bit from Donald Trump's victory speech very early Wednesday morning to his supporters gathered in West Palm Beach, Florida, as the former U.S. president, now re-elected president for a second time, describes the voters who helped him achieve what he and others are calling the greatest comeback victory ever. After 4 years out of office, the 45th American president will return to the White House in early January and be sworn in as the 47th. For months, the outcome of the election had been seen as too close to call. But Trump's pledge to fix the U.S. economy, crack down on illegal immigrants, and put America first appealed to more voters, mainly men, mainly white, mainly Latinos, and folks without a college education, while the more progressive identity politics offered by the Biden administration and continued by Kamala Harris appealed mostly to women voters, college-educated folks, Black Americans, and most of the country's Jews, which is why you'll notice Trump didn't mention Jewish Americans in his speech at all. Remember that earlier during the campaign, he warned Jews it would be their fault if he lost. So where does that leave Jewish Americans now? And what will a second Trump presidency mean for American Jews and for Israel? And for Canada? Trump has said he wants to stop wars, not start them. But observers worry Trump's strongman rhetoric and anti-immigrant attacks sound a lot like last century's wartime dictators that have proven to be catastrophic for Jews throughout history.
Jews historically have supported Democratic candidates, but now the Jewish community really finds itself, facing a conundrum because it's like the song, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Who do you support? Donald Trump and the Republican Party that could turn on you on a dime?
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Wednesday, November 6th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation.
In Berlin, rumors are spreading.
Holocaust victims, their bodies are just dug up.
It's a shunda.
But the truth is even more unnerving.
Was your family in the Shoah?
Dude looks like he was in the Shoah.
As the world panics...
This is some ritual, bringing the dead back to life.
No, you said this wasn't illegal.
It isn't, I don't think.
One woman seeks the truth.
These are questions you can't answer.
And you're too afraid to even ask them.
Justice, a Holocaust zombie story. An original audio drama from the CJN in association with the Ashkenaz Foundation. Listen now at thecjn.ca/zombies or wherever you get your podcasts.
What a day to return from my 2 weeks vacation. I was on a Danube River cruise starting in Hungary, where Trump's ally Viktor Orban, another authoritarian leader, sent his congratulations. And when I was away, our producer, Zachary Judah Kaufman, sat in for me. And because of the jet lag, I fell asleep long before the pollsters officially declared the election in Trump's favor. Today, though, as Trump speaks to world leaders like Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, who was his first to send congratulations, and also hearing from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who called the friendship between Canada and the U.S. the, quote, envy of the world, unquote, and pledged to work together, even though it's widely known the two men didn't get along so well the first time. We'll try to make some sense of this historic moment and what Trump's surprisingly strong victory means, with two Canadians who are experts on American politics. Don Abelson is a political science professor at McMaster University and editor of History Has Made Us Friends, and also his most recent book, Understanding American Politics. He's in Hamilton. I'm joined also by David Weinfeld, a professor of Jewish history and American Jewish culture. He's at Rowan University, which is in New Jersey, just across the border from Pennsylvania, where Weinfeld actually lives. Welcome both of you to the CJN Daily.
Great to be with you, Ellen. And David.
Thanks a lot. Glad to be here.
Don, why don't we start with you? You were in Washington. What were you doing there?
Just to get a sense of the mood in Washington, D.C., it's been a city that I've gone to many, many times because of the kind of work that I do in American politics. I really wanted to get a a feeling for, how people were doing and what they were talking about in cabs and restaurants. I was able to attend a women's rally. There were 10,000 people in Freedom Plaza protesting about reproductive rights and their concern about that. People are deeply concerned because we know, regardless of the outcome, now that we know that Trump will secure a second presidency, America remains fundamentally divided. And, half the people, close to half the people were opposed to him, although he picked up more popular votes than Kamala Harris. I think the first time a Republican candidate has done that in over 30 years. Took the White House back, and for all intents and purposes, the Republicans will likely control both the Senate and the House. So it was an evening that couldn't have gone any better for the Republicans, probably couldn't have gone any worse, for the Democrats.
David, you're living in one of the key states, which is Pennsylvania. Tell me what your night and day were like.
Well, my day, I tried to keep myself distracted after I voted in the morning. I'm a dual citizen, but I've been living in Philadelphia. I've been doing some canvassing myself, I'll admit, for the Harris campaign. So I've definitely been exposed to a key portion of the voting public in a key swing state. And I will say that I was, to borrow a term that's not my own, I was nauseously optimistic going into the election. But I was also then surprised that not only that Donald Trump won the popular vote, but that he won in Pennsylvania fairly handily. And I think a lot of people were surprised as well.
We should talk a bit about Pennsylvania because there are three, or maybe two for sure, maybe three very strong pro-Israel people that are going to be in Washington. Fetterman and maybe the senator, because they're still counting, David McCormick. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Josh Shapiro, the new governor, who is a Jew. What kind of influence do you think Pennsylvania will have on policy when there are three very pro-Israel candidates that it looks like they're all going to be in Washington?
Those three candidates are part of a pro-Israel consensus between the two parties that has existed for some time, that the isolationist wing of Donald Trump's party is pushing back against quite fiercely. And so in the short term, I do think that kind of pro-Israel consensus is likely to hold. But in the long term, if Trump is more interested in being a figurehead than an actual president, if he becomes incapacitated for some reason, if he is manipulated by either his vice president or by Elon Musk or other interests, I think you might start to see that pro-Israel consensus fracturing more significantly.
I mean, one of the questions that I've been asked now for several weeks after Kamala Harris chose her vice presidential running mate was, did she make a mistake? Should she have gone with Josh Shapiro? And so I would just be interested, given the fact that you worked on the campaign, you live in Pennsylvania, what do you think the mental calculus was at the time to convince Harris to go with a Minnesota governor who lost his state, didn't deliver the electoral votes from Minnesota, rather than going with someone who's obviously incredibly bright and charismatic and coherent, articulate, in Josh Shapiro. So what do you think was going on behind the scenes? Do you think Harris was concerned about an anti-Semitic backlash?
Yeah, I absolutely do think she was concerned about that. I think that she bought into the myth that the VP pick matters more than it does. Unfortunately, I don't think Josh Shapiro could have delivered Pennsylvania. I think she picked walls to appease the wing of the party that is more critical of Bibi Netanyahu's administration in Israel, certainly. And I think that gamble failed. in the end that it didn't really appease them, though it's not clear to me that that was significant either. I don't think foreign policy decided this election at all. The coalition that Donald Trump assembled, I mean, I'm a humanities professor and we talk about race, class, and gender, and I just think gender was such a huge role in this election. I think it is such a heavily male coalition. The number of Hispanic men who voted for Donald Trump, I mean, we don't necessarily have accurate numbers from exit polls yet, but it's going to be enormous. And that, even despite all the denigrating of Hispanics, that's been a theme of his campaign since 2015. It's just remarkable. And he actually did well with Hispanic women too, but really it's this cross-class, cross-ethnicity male coalition that I think is a big factor.
It is remarkable to me. It's frightening, but it's also remarkable that it doesn't seem to matter that Trump would go out of his way in his rallies to condemn entire classes of people, that he would rant about people who should have their minds or have their heads examined if they don't vote for him, during a period of increased anti-Semitism, to make such offensive and frightening remarks. But it doesn't seem to matter. I mean, we used to refer to Ronald Reagan as the Teflon president. Nothing would stick. You know what? When you look at Trump, despite all the indictments, despite all the horrific, allegations, despite all the things he's done to thwart the U.S. Constitution, yet he still managed to keep that coalition together. And it is shocking to me.
He didn't just keep it together, though. He grew it. He grew the coalition, and that's why I would take it a step further and say all the things that you just listed, for many voters, were benefits to his campaign. They helped his campaign, right? His machismo attracted voters, right? Whereas people thought that, reproductive rights would be an issue that would really help Harris a lot. As it turns out, a lot of people who might agree with her on reproductive rights voted for Trump.
The Jewish exit polls that I've seen, NBC and Washington Post and the Forward, almost 70% of American Jews voted Democrat. Trump said that any Jew who votes for them is a traitor, and he blamed the Jews if he lost. So right. Again, in this whole timeline of hateful rhetoric against the Jewish minority, now what is the status of America's Jews?
Jews in the United States constitute a little less than 2.5% of the population. 2.5%. Yet for Donald Trump to come out and make those kind of outlandish statements, scapegoating the Jewish people as if we haven't seen that before. Can you imagine in this environment, which is so toxic, which is so laden, and given the increase, the significant increase in anti-Semitic incidents over the past several years, that anyone in their right mind would make those comments. But again, it's symptomatic of a larger problem, which is, what do Jews do now? Do they continue supporting the Democratic Party? Well, there are fringes in the Democratic Party that many Jews are very uncomfortable with. Do they support a Republican administration that, some members catering to white nationalists? They're between a rock and a hard place, right? You've got, as the song goes, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you. In political science classes, when we taught American politics, we often talked about ticket splitting or split ticketing. The fact that you would vote for, let's say, a Republican president, but a Democratic senator or a Democratic representative, because you just felt more comfortable, distributing your vote between the two parties, or perhaps you'd vote for an independent. For the last number of years, we've rarely talked about it because the country has become so incredibly polarized and partisan. The Jewish community in the United States might have to rethink this strategy, because you have a Donald Trump now who will take the oath of office in January. You have elements in both parties that don't sit well with many Jews across the country. So how exactly do you navigate your way through this political process that has become far more complicated and in many ways poisonous?
David, what should we do? What should the American Jews do?
I don't want us to forget the old adage, two Jews, three opinions. So there are obviously different Jewish groups that are at play here. The exit poll numbers, have often been questionable in the past. So we don't really know what the percent. I've seen a quote of 79% for the Jewish vote. That seems hard for me to believe. But 79% for Democrats, I mean. But then I also saw Richie Torres saying that 43% of Jews in New York voted for Trump in New York State. I don't know if that's accurate either. What I will say this is that we are seeing a phenomenon even that we've been seeing for many years now, solidifying, which is that you have the Orthodox Jews voting one way and other Jews voting another way. Orthodox Jews vote like evangelical Christians. Non-Orthodox Jews are behaving politically in a very different way, just as they're behaving in their synagogues in a different way than Orthodox Jews are. And you're also seeing a generational shift. The younger generation of Jews in the United States is much more like, especially if they're non-Orthodox, are much more likely to be critical of Israel than an older generation, and that gap's going to widen as as the Jewish population, which still is an elderly population, as it becomes a younger population, that gap's going to widen.
But we can't forget, obviously, how important it is for more conservative-oriented Jews, not necessarily Orthodox, but conservative, who have aligned themselves with Israel during this terrible period, who have prioritized as their number one issue, not inflation, not the economy, not the housing crisis, not education or healthcare, the safety, security, and survival of the state of Israel. And I've heard already, I returned from Washington this morning, from Jewish friends and family members, some of whom are relieved that Trump won, others who are, shocked and dismayed. Jews don't generally vote as a monolith, as you rightly point out, but how are they prioritizing their concerns today? And I think that has to factor into a lot of the polling and surveys that will have to be conducted.
Right, because Trump said that he's going to stop wars, not start them. But he also said during the debate, if you remember, our listeners might remember watching it, that, before he gets to take the oath of office, he's going to solve the Israel-Gaza, and he's going to end it with one phone call, and maybe be way more supportive of Netanyahu, who, even though they had a little, broigus for a while, they seem to be back on good terms again after a couple of visits to Mar-a-Lago and some phone calls. So is this better for the Jews and Israel that Trump is in? And then Abraham Accords / Israel is another issue. Quickly, both of you, yes, no?
I'll just say quickly, it depends on what you take to be better for Israel. If you take to be better for Israel more support of Bibi's government, which also includes Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the settler wing, then in the short term, as I said, I think it is better for Israel. If you are critical of the Bibi, Smotrich, Ben Gvir coalition, then it is worse for Israel. If you think they're leading Israel down a path of further bloodshed for Israelis and Palestinians, and lack of attention to the hostages, which I think has been quite clear that's been the Bibi path.
Right. We're talking also about military support funding, right? Because about $18 billion U.S. was given under Biden, U.S. dollars to the Israeli military in the last year. Whereas, do you think Trump is going to do the America First pullback with Ukraine, with Israel? Don, I'll throw this to you.
Yeah, no, I think Trump, a lot is going to depend on the people that Trump ends up appointing to senior level positions. One of the many things that we're concerned about is he had some very good people. We might not have cared for them, but, very experienced, generals and other advisors, and he invariably ended up in significant conflicts with them. Many of them resigned out of protest. A lot is going to depend on who's remaining, who he's listening to. It's often been said of Trump that the best way to influence him is to be the last person in the room before he makes a decision. So we're going to have to pay very, very close attention to the national security team, the foreign policy team, to get a better sense of what they are thinking about. For the United States, I think they would like nothing more than to see an end to the conflict in Gaza. There's no doubt they would prefer to see, Netanyahu, rein in a bit and move toward a solution that will allow the hostages to be returned. So a lot is going to depend on the voices in the room. But the other thing, too, we have to consider, and David made this point, part of the backlash against Harris, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, when we focus on the state of Michigan, which has the largest Arab population in the United States, what percentage of Muslims, of Arabs, voted against Harris because of the Biden administration's support for Israel? So as the demographic of the United States continues to change and younger Jewish voters begin to align themselves more closely with the left wing of the Democratic Party, is there going to be more pressure on future Democratic presidential candidates, not necessarily to capitulate, but to acquiesce in ways that otherwise in other times they might feel more uncomfortable with? So I think short term, Israel benefits by having Trump in office. Long term, it becomes a little bit more questionable.
I want to jump in because we need to move on to Canada. But before we do, I'm going to quote back to yourself, David, in the 2018 column that you wrote for the CJN after the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh when 11 worshipers were murdered by a terrorist. You wrote that, quote, American Jews should feel less safe because Donald Trump is the most significant anti-Semitic threat in the U.S. today from the right-wing nationalism empowered by Donald Trump. Remember writing that? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. We're 7 years later.
I still think it's true. I think that we are seeing an alarming amount of anti-Semitism that is coming from the quote-unquote left now as well, in light of, Israel's response to the Hamas atrocities on October 7th. I think that the anti-Semitism that we're seeing from the left is sometimes not exactly from the left. What I mean to say by that is, for example, people sometimes would refer to the Nation of Islam as kind of a left-wing group because they were in, opposition to some conservative American policies. But if you look at actually their core set of beliefs, they're a deeply conservative group. And I think you're seeing some of the quote-unquote left-wing opposition is coming from parts of, not all of the Arab Muslim community, obviously, but parts of the Arab Muslim community that you might otherwise call conservative or right-wing. So I think that's important to recognize. I still believe that the right wing is more heavily armed. The right wing is engaging in a more old-fashioned, pernicious kind of difference-based anti-Semitism, really rooted in this idea that Jews are fundamentally different than other people. And have different values and are sinister and are conspiratorial. The anti-Semitism that you see on the left, which is anti-Semitism and is pernicious, is really still largely an example of what I call anti-Semitism of sameness. It's this disappointment that they think Jews should be more progressive, and they end up being less progressive than they should be because of their Zionism, because of their support for Israel. And while I think that definitely causes problems, I don't think it is nearly as dangerous as what we see on the right.
Hateful speech and rhetoric started with Donald Trump opening the box on all minorities back in 2016 when he was campaigning, where now that he's in again and doing it so much more, and we call it normalized, how scared should Jewish people be?
The danger here for Trump is he's developing this kind of cross-racial anti-Semitism that I think is really scary. And you saw that kind of personified when he was having meetings with Kanye West, or Ye, who's African American, and also Nick Fuentes, who is partly of Hispanic origin. This is a cross-ethnic coalition, if you will, that's deeply, deeply anti-Semitic, and that's really scary to me.
Yeah, I would just add one quick thing that we know that politics makes for strange bedfellows. We saw during the early 1980s that there was a broad-based coalition at one point between members of the Republican Party and the Nation of Islam. And people thought, oh my God, how do you put these two groups together? We're starting to see the same thing now on the Democratic side. So the rally to which I referred, a women's march to protect reproductive rights in Washington, D.C., almost 10,000 people. And you had Feminists for Palestine. You had other groups that were quite vocal in their condemnation of Israel. So it's not just about, second wave feminism, third wave feminism. You now have groups of people with whom, others are feeling comfortable aligning with. Some are, some aren't. So again, that's another development that helps to, fan the flames. And I think that puts off a lot of voters.
Okay, we have to talk about Canada. I read something on social media that Canada woke up and felt like you have a meth production lab in your basement, and that's kind of how we feel. Now what does this mean? Trump is cracking down on immigration. He doesn't get along with Trudeau. So let's start with you, Don. What are some of the talking points for Canada with the Trump presidency coming up 2.0?
I think one of the things that we can credit Trudeau for is he recognized years ago, through a lot of prompting, I think, from Brian Mulroney and other conservatives, including Stephen Harper, that it's so important for Canadian policymakers to closely monitor and nurture the Canada-U.S. relationship. There's some issues, including trade, environmental cooperation, immigration, border security, our stature on the world stage, that are deeply impacted by our relationship with the United States. And many of our former prime ministers have often said, although they too have walked a tightrope between, appeasing American interests while at the same time appeasing Canadian nationalists, that the United States offers us, if the relationship is warm and cozy, an opportunity to grow our presence internationally. I think going forward, Trudeau, whether it's Poilievre, have to not only maintain, but ramp up their degree of advocacy in terms of strengthening Canada-U.S. ties. Working with state governors, for approximately 30 states, Canada is their number one export market. Working with people on Capitol Hill, in civil society organizations, in religious institutions, to strengthen those alliances so we are better equipped and positioned to advocate for the issues that we care about deeply. Yes, you're absolutely right, Ellen. Trudeau dealt with 4 very tumultuous years with Trump. I thought he was very diplomatic today in his speech, in the House of Commons. But they know that it's going to be tricky. And the last thing you want to do is bury your head in the sand and work and wait for the political storms to blow over. You need to be proactive. You need to be aggressive. We need to get out of our comfort zone and realize that the only way we're going to gain traction is by developing, nurturing, and strengthening the relationships we have with key players in the United States.
Except that, remember, Trump didn't show up to Canada when his first state visit was where? Saudi Arabia? Then he went to Mexico. He didn't come to Canada for 2.5 to 3 years.
But that's okay, because most of the important things that take place in the Canada-U.S. relationship, we rarely turn the spotlight on. That's at the bureaucratic level. That's at the staff level. So prime ministers and presidents don't necessarily have to get along. It's better if they do, but even if they don't, there are ways to rein them in, and there are ways to keep their eyes focused on interests that are important. You have 2 sovereign states that try to advance their own interests. At times those interests align, at other times they don't. But you have to be strategic about it, especially if you're the junior partner in an asymmetrical power relationship.
Do you want to weigh in on that, David?
I can't weigh in as much on sort of the policy side, but I can think back to when the presidency of George W. Bush, and how sort of from the perspective of Canada's standing in the world, there was a great deal of pride, I think, among a lot of Canadians that Canada seemed to be charting a different path than the more conservative, both in terms of foreign policy, but also policy on things like gay marriage and same-sex marriage and all the rest, right? Canada had this kind of reputation of being a more tolerant place. And you saw that again, with the emergence of Trump in his campaign in 2015 and 2016, with his rhetoric on immigration and against Muslim countries and against Mexico and other Hispanic countries versus Trudeau's image, right, was a much more tolerant and compassionate one at the time, taking in Syrian refugees. And I think that, again, I can't speak on the policy level as much, but in terms of the image that Canada was portraying to the rest of the world, I think that was something that Canadians were actually very proud of. To distinguish themselves from the United States in that regard, and so I don't know if Poilievre is going to be able to or going to want to take that kind of course if he comes to power. But Trudeau, I think, might have some incentive to maintain or to come back to that to that kind of image to help his own cause.
Yeah, but I think, and I'm not a political, actually I am a political scientist. That's what I majored in university. What am I talking about? But yeah, and a political Parliamentary Hill reporter for many years. But I think that's completely changed in terms of the Canadian Jewish community now, in terms of how it's feeling about Trudeau's open immigration policies and what we're seeing on the streets of our cities and our university campuses and our protests and online in Canada. And not just the Jewish community, the Sikh, Khalistani, Indian protests that are going on. We'll see what happens in the next election, but I think that is over now. The woke progressive Canadians are done. And then, of course, you have to bring in, you mentioned environment. Biden canceled Keystone, and that was a big issue. And it's now Alberta and many conservatives want to, the carbon tax, they want to get rid of it. Anyway, we can talk about that and how that's going to play out with U.S. politics once January comes back. He comes back into office. I want to just give you the last minute to wrap up. David, I'll start with you. Something important that you think our listeners should take away from the Trump victory and the Harris defeat?
Since it's this Canadian Jewish news, I think that Jewish people, from my point of view, Trump is not a reliable ally. Absolutely not. And I think American Jews should be cognizant of that. And I think Canadian Jews should be cognizant of that. I think Israeli Jews and all Israelis should be cognizant of that. That Trump is out for Trump. And he's going to be out for Trump even more again. And the people that might be even pulling the strings also may not be as interested in appealing to Jews and Jewish concerns as well. So it's a dangerous game to play if you want to try to ally yourself with that figure and that side.
Right, because he's got Orban, Putin, all the strongmen, where democracy and fascism, pro-neo-fascism are... Dawn, what should our listeners be thinking about as they try to digest this from a Canadian-U.S. point of view?
I think all right-thinking people, and I don't mean right ideologically, just right-thinking people should look at what has happened in the United States, not only on November 5th, but over the last several years, and that should serve as a cautionary tale for what could happen in other democratic countries. That we need to be vigilant, we need to be proactive. We need to keep, focused on what our elected leaders are doing. I could not agree more with what David just said. I always remind my students, look at the back of an American dollar bill. What does it say? In God we trust, not in government we trust. Americans love God. They don't love government. Trump has made it very easy for us in the humanities and in the social sciences and in the media to construct a personality profile. And as Charles de Gaulle once remarked, any state worthy of its name has no friends, only interests. And I would suspect Trump would agree with that. As Canadians, we need to be concerned about the level of rhetoric and toxicity that could also pollute our provinces and territories and federal government. So again, I don't want to leave with offering an apocalyptic, prediction, but engagement is so vitally important. The youth vote is very important. We need to get involved. Our Jewish organizations need to be increasingly vigilant and monitoring what's going on, but taking the steps we need to take in order to protect ourselves, because at the end, as we know, in looking throughout, Jewish history, at the end of the day, it's entirely going to be up to us.
When fascism happens and dictatorships happens, it's never good for the Jews. It might be good at the beginning.
No. And what's shocking too is, I've been to the Holocaust Memorial in Washington many, many times, but I went again during this last trip, and just making my way through the displays, over about 2.5 to 3 hours, you could look at the displays and you could substitute the names of Adolf Hitler and his henchmen for the kind of things that, Donald Trump has said over the last few years. That in and of itself should frighten most logically thinking people.
Even Trump's chief of staff said that he was a fascist before he left.
Of course, he is.
He is. Or what he is an authoritarian and with terrible, misogynistic, racist impulses at the very least.
Absolutely. No question about it.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, which was made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Our podcast is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman, the executive producer is Michael Freeman, and the theme music was composed by Dov Beck-Levine. Love to hear from you about the Trump victory. Are you pro-Trump? Tell us why. Are your friends and family in the U.S. asking for immigration advice to move to Canada? We're at info@thecjn.ca. And thanks for listening. Good to be back.